In the autumn of 1887, while every family in Cedar Ridge, Nebraska was racing to build wooden houses that reached toward the sky, there was an 18-year-old girl digging straight down into the earth like she was preparing her own grave. The neighbors called her the Mole Girl. They did not know that in 47 days that hole in the ground would save 23 lives, including the very people who stood on the ridge laughing at her now. Ingrid Magnusson worked alone in the amber light of late October, her shovel biting into the Nebraska soil with a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Beside her, a shepherd mix named Copper lay with his head on his paws, watching her with eyes the color of autumn wheat. He never wandered far. He never needed to be told to stay. The wind carried voices from the valley below, in where the other homesteaders were celebrating another barn raising, another proper house going up, another family doing things the right way, the American way, the way that made sense to people who had never known a winter that could kill you in 3 minutes flat. Ingrid did not look up. She kept working. The story of how she came to be here, alone on this hill, with nothing but a dog and a shovel, was written in the calluses on her hands and the silence she wore like armor. She was born in Tromsø, Norway, in the winter of 1869, when the northern lights danced above her mother's labor and her grandfather declared it a sign of a special child. Her grandfather, Olaf Magnusson, had spent 40 years in the mines of northern Norway, where he learned the one truth that would save his granddaughter's life decades later in an ocean away. The earth remembers what we forget. Below the frost line, roughly 4 feet down in most places, the ground maintains a constant temperature of around 54 degrees Fahrenheit. Not because the earth generates heat, but because the earth is memory. It stores the warmth of summer in its bones and releases it slowly through the winter. It stores the cool of winter and offers it back in summer. The earth is patient. The earth does not panic. The earth simply remembers. Olaf taught Ingrid this when she was barely old enough to walk, taking her into the mine shafts where workers stripped down to their undershirts, even while blizzards raged above. He showed her how the old people of Norway built their homes half into the hillsides, how the turf roofs were not primitive but brilliant, how the thick walls of earth and stone held warmth like a mother holds a child. And then, when Ingrid was 12 years old, her mother died. It happened in the wooden house her father had built when he decided to modernize, to abandon the old ways, to prove that the Magnusson family was moving forward. The house had gaps in the walls that whistled in the wind. The house had a roof that leaked heat like a sieve leaks water. The house was cold in ways that crept into the bones and never left. Ingrid's mother, already weakened from a difficult pregnancy that ended in a stillborn son, caught consumption in that cold house. The tuberculosis settled into her lungs like ice settling into cracks in stone. She coughed through the autumn. She weakened through the early winter. By February, she was gone. And the last words she ever spoke to Ingrid were simple and devastating. "This house is killing me, child. Never forget what the old ways knew." Ingrid was not the same after that. Something hardened in her, something that would not bend no matter how hard the world tried to break it. When her father remarried a year later to a woman named Helga, who looked at Ingrid like she was a stain on otherwise clean linen, Ingrid began to plan her escape. She worked. She saved. She studied the Homestead Act and learned that any citizen over 21 or any 18-year-old who was head of household could claim 160 acres of government land for free as long as they improved it and lived on it for 5 years. At 16, Ingrid left her father's house in the middle of the night. She did not say goodbye. She did not leave a note. She simply walked out into the darkness with a small bag of clothes and her grandfather's journal, filled with diagrams and measurements and the accumulated wisdom of 40 years underground. She found work in the coal mines of Pennsylvania, one of the only places that would hire a young woman with strong hands and a stronger silence. It was there, in the perpetual twilight of the tunnels, that she found copper. The dog had been abandoned by a miner who moved on to another camp. He was half-starved, covered in coal dust, and so scared of humans that he bit anyone who came close. But something about Ingrid made him pause. Something about her stillness, her patience, the way she sat near him day after day without reaching for him, without demanding anything. After 2 weeks, Copper came to her. He pressed his nose against her hand and then collapsed at her feet like he had been waiting his whole life to find someone worth trusting. They had been inseparable ever since. By the time Ingrid turned 18, she had saved enough money to travel west and file her claim. She chose Nebraska because the land office clerk told her that the territory around Cedar Ridge was good soil, plenty of water, and winters that were cold but manageable. He was wrong about the winters, but Ingrid already knew that. She arrived in September of 1887 with everything she owned in a single trunk and a dog who pressed against her legs whenever strangers came too close. The claim she was assigned sat on a south-facing hillside about 2 miles from the center of Cedar Ridge, land that nobody else wanted because the slope made it difficult for plowing. Surely Ingrid did not want to plow. She wanted to dig. The first week she lived in a canvas tent while she explored her land, searching for the right spot. She found it on the third day, a section of the hillside where the soil was dense clay mixed with sand, stable enough to hold a tunnel but soft enough to cut with a shovel. She marked the spot with a pile of stones and began planning. The other homesteaders noticed her almost immediately. Cedar Ridge was a small community, maybe 30 families, and a young woman arriving alone was unusual enough to warrant attention. A young woman arriving alone and not immediately seeking a husband was unusual enough to warrant suspicion. When word spread that she was digging a hole in the hillside instead of building a proper house, the suspicion turned to mockery. Marcus Whitmore was the first to come see for himself. He was a man of 47 years, with a face weathered by 2 decades of Nebraska wind and a certainty in his own experience that left no room for anyone else's wisdom. He rode up on a chestnut mare, stopped at the edge of the excavation Ingrid had begun, and laughed loud enough to startle the birds from the nearby cottonwood trees. Girls digging her own grave before winter even comes. Somebody ought to tell her that's the undertaker's job, not hers. The men who had ridden with him laughed. The sound echoed across the empty prairie, like crows calling to each other. Ingrid did not look up. She did not acknowledge his presence. She simply drove her shovel into the earth, lifted the soil, deposited it to the side, and repeated the motion with a rhythm as old as the mountains of Norway. This infuriated Marcus more than any argument could have. He rode away still laughing, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that suggested he was not accustomed to being ignored. That night around the fire that warmed the gathering at Henderson's barn, Marcus told the story of what he had seen. I've been in this territory 25 years. 25 years of building, of surviving, of watching people come and go. And I have never, not once, seen anything as foolish as what that girl is doing on Miller's old claim. Within a week, everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about the mole girl. The reactions varied, but none of them were kind. The women whispered behind their hands about her lack of proper upbringing, about the scandal of a young woman living alone. Yeah, about what kind of family would allow such a thing. The men made jokes about her building her own grave before winter even arrived. The children dared each other to sneak up to the hillside and watch the crazy lady dig. Billy Whitmore, Marcus's 19-year-old son, started a betting pool. The boy had inherited his father's confidence without yet earning it, and he saw mocking the mole girl as a way to prove himself among the older men. $5 said she would give up within 2 weeks. $10 said she would freeze to death by Christmas. $20 said she would come begging for shelter at the first hard frost. Nobody bet on her succeeding. Nobody could even imagine what success would look like. Through it all, Ingrid kept working. If you had asked Ingrid why she did not respond to the mockery, she would not have been able to explain it in words. The truth was deeper than language. rooted in memories of her grandfather's hands showing her how to read the earth, in the echo of her mother's last words. In the 2 years of silence she had practiced in the coal mines where talking wasted energy, and energy was survival. She knew something they did not know. She had seen winters they could not imagine, and she understood, with the certainty that comes from watching someone you love die because of other people's ignorance, that words would never convince them. Only the winter would convince them. Only the cold would teach them what she already knew. So she worked in silence, and she let the hole in the hillside speak for itself. By the end of October, she had dug 10 feet into the slope. The entrance was 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, big enough to walk through without ducking. She reinforced the walls with a technique her grandfather had shown her, packing the cut surfaces with a mixture of clay and straw that dried into something almost as hard as brick. The ceiling she supported with cottonwood logs, the cheapest timber available along the river bottoms, spacing them every 2 feet and wedging them tight against the earth above. It was hard work, the kind of work that left her shoulders burning and her hands bleeding, and her entire body so exhausted that she fell asleep the moment she lay down at night. But it was also satisfying in a way she could not explain, watching the space take shape, feeling the temperature change as she went deeper, and noting with quiet satisfaction that the thermometer she had brought from Pennsylvania held steady at 54 degrees, no matter how cold the October nights became. The first real validation came from an unexpected source. Old Sven Lindqvist was 78 years old, a Swedish immigrant who had come to Nebraska in the 1850s and outlived 3 wives, 5 children, and every expectation that a man of his age should have died already. He lived alone in a small cabin at the edge of town, kept mostly to himself, and was generally considered to be somewhat eccentric. He showed up at Ingrid's dig site on a gray morning in early November, when the first frost had turned the prairie grass silver, and the other homesteaders were busy sealing their windows and stacking firewood against their walls. He stood at the entrance of the tunnel for a long time, saying nothing, just looking. Copper growled softly, but Ingrid put a hand on his head and he settled. Finally, the old man spoke. The words came out in Swedish, rough with age but clear with recognition. Jag förstår. Jag minns. I understand. I remember. Ingrid's Swedish was not fluent, but she understood enough. She nodded. He walked into the tunnel, running his gnarled hands along the walls, examining the log supports, checking the angle of the floor where she had built in a slight drainage slope. When he reached the back where she was still expanding, he stopped and stood very still, breathing the cool air that smelled of earth and mineral and something ancient. When he emerged, his eyes were wet. He reached out and gripped Ingrid's forearm with surprising strength. The old ways. They laugh at the old ways now, but the old ways will outlast them all. He nodded once, firmly, and then walked away without another word. Ingrid watched him go, feeling something loosen in her chest that she had not realized was tight. The discovery came 3 days after Sven's visit. Ingrid's shovel struck something hard about 15 feet back from the entrance. At first she thought it was a rock, but when she cleared away the soil, she found a rusted metal box about the size of a loaf of bread. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pried it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had mostly rotted away, was a leather journal. The pages were water-stained and fragile, but still readable. The name on the first page was Eric Halverson. Ingrid sat down right there in the dirt, her back against the tunnel wall, and began to read. Eric Halverson had been a Norwegian immigrant, just like her grandfather. He had claimed this very land in 1871, 2 years after the Homestead Act expanded into Nebraska. He had planned to build a dugout home into the hillside using the same techniques his father had used in the old country, but his wife was ashamed. The other settlers mocked the idea. A proper American family, she argued, should have a proper American house. So Eric built a wooden cabin instead. The journal entries grew shorter as winter approached in 1872. complaining about the cost of wood, noting the gaps where the wind came through, describing how the stove struggled to keep up with the cold. The last entry was dated January 15, 1873. The writing was shaky, barely legible. The storm has raged for 3 days now, and the temperature is beyond anything the thermometer can measure. The walls are covered in ice on the inside. My wife and son stopped shivering yesterday. I cannot feel my feet. I should have listened to my father. I should have built into the earth. This wooden house is my coffin. If anyone finds this, remember, the earth will protect you. The works of man will fail. Ingrid closed the journal with trembling hands. She sat in the darkness of her tunnel for a long time, feeling the steady 54-degree air against her skin, listening to her own heartbeat, thinking about a man who had known the truth and abandoned it because of what other people thought. She thought about her mother, coughing in that cold wooden house. She thought about the homesteaders in the valley below, so proud of their tall wooden walls and their glass windows and their belief that they had conquered the wilderness. When she finally emerged from the tunnel, the sun was setting and Copper was waiting for her with patient eyes. The next morning, Ingrid rode into Cedar Ridge and requested to speak at the community gathering that evening. The gathering was held at Henderson's barn, as it always was, in the large open space where the hay would be stored once there was hay to store. About 60 people crowded inside, families from all over the region, their faces lit by oil lamps and the central fire in the stone hearth that Henderson had built with his own hands. Ingrid stood at the front, feeling the weight of 60 pairs of eyes, most of them skeptical, many of them amused. She held up Eric Halvorson's journal. This was written by a man who died on my land, a Norwegian like my grandfather. He knew how to build a shelter that would survive the winter, but he listened to people who told him the old ways were foolish. He built a wooden house instead, and he died in it, along with his wife and son. The room stirred. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through wheat. Marcus Whitmore snorted from his seat near the fire. Girl finds an old book and thinks she knows more than folks who've lived here their whole lives. Father O'Brien, the Irish priest who served the scattered Catholic families of the region, leaned forward with a frown. Miss Magnuson, perhaps you might consider that there are reasons we build houses the way we do. Christian people live above the ground, not in it like animals. A man named Dr. Franklin Holt, an engineer from Chicago who was surveying the region for a railroad company, raised an eyebrow with professional skepticism. I have examined that structure of yours. The ceiling will collapse under the weight of the first heavy snow. The walls will absorb moisture and breed disease. It is, with all due respect, a death trap. Billy Whitmore laughed outright, and several other young men joined him. Maybe she's planning to hibernate like a bear. Wake up in spring and see if anyone's still around to laugh at her. Laughter rippled through the crowd, louder this time. Evelyn Ashford, the wealthy widow who owned 3 farms in the region, stood up with the quiet authority of old money. Her voice cut through the noise like a blade. Child, I appreciate your enthusiasm. Oh, but perhaps you should leave the business of surviving winters to those of us who have actually done it. When you've been here as long as we have, you'll understand why we do things the way we do. More laughter filled the barn. Ingrid stood there, letting the laughter wash over her, feeling Copper press against her legs under the table where he had hidden himself from the crowd. She did not try to explain thermal mass. She did not attempt to describe the frost line or the stable temperature of underground spaces. She had learned in the mines that some lessons cannot be taught with words. She simply looked at Marcus Whitmore and spoke the only words that mattered. You will see. Marcus held her gaze for a long moment. Something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been doubt. But it disappeared quickly under the weight of 25 years of certainty. The next day, the temperature dropped 15 degrees. Winter was coming. If you were Ingrid, standing on that hillside with dirt under your fingernails, and the laughter of neighbors echoing from the valley below. Would you trust the wisdom passed down from a grandfather you barely remember? Or would you listen to people who have lived on this land for decades? That was the choice she faced every single day. And every single day she chose to keep working. By the end of November, Ingrid's tunnel had become something more than a hole in a hillside. It had become a home. The main chamber extended 20 feet into the slope, 14 feet wide and 7 feet tall at the center, where the ceiling curved slightly like the inside of a barrel. She had smoothed the walls with a mixture of clay and lime that dried to a pale cream color, almost luminous in the lamplight. The floor was packed earth covered with woven grass mats that she had made herself during the long evenings. A small iron stove sat against the back wall, its pipe running up through a shaft she had dug to the surface above. This was the detail that skeptics had said would never work, that smoke would fill the space and suffocate her. But Ingrid understood something about air that her critics did not. Warm air rises, cold air sinks. If you place your stove at the back of a dugout and your entrance at the front, with the entrance slightly lower than the floor inside, the warm air from the stove will rise up the chimney shaft while the cold air flows in through the entrance, one creating a constant, gentle circulation that keeps the air fresh and the fire burning. Her grandfather had explained this with diagrams drawn in coal dust on the mine floor. Now she saw it working exactly as he had described, the stove drawing perfectly, the air inside fresh and clean, the temperature stable even before she lit a fire. With a fire going, on a day when the outside temperature had dropped to 20 degrees, the inside of her dugout was a comfortable 62. The bed occupied one corner, a simple wooden frame filled with a mattress she had stuffed with dried prairie grass. Above it, she had carved a small shelf into the wall where she kept her grandfather's journal, Eric Halverson's journal, and the small portrait of her mother that was the only thing she had taken from her father's house. One copper had claimed the space beside the bed, a nest of old blankets where he curled up each night, his eyes following Ingrid until she fell asleep, and then, and only then, closing. A wooden table sat in the center of the room with two chairs she had built from cottonwood branches. The chairs were rough, not pretty, but solid enough to last decades. She had learned in the mines that pretty was less important than permanent. The storage area was impressive for a structure that had cost her nothing but labor. She had dug alcoves into the walls, each one stacked with provisions, sacks of flour and cornmeal, jars of preserved vegetables she had put up during the harvest, dried meat hanging from hooks driven into the ceiling logs. Enough food for one person to survive 2 months without leaving the dugout once. The root cellar went even deeper. In a hole dug below the floor level where the temperature stayed cold enough to preserve butter and milk. She had lined it with stones from the nearby creek, creating a natural refrigerator that would keep food fresh through even the hottest summer. All of this she built with her own hands, working 12 and 14-hour days, racing against a clock that only she seemed to hear ticking. The other homesteaders continued to watch and wonder. Dr. Franklin Holt came by 3 times during November, taking measurements and making notes in a leather-bound notebook. He was a man of 52 years who believed in numbers, in engineering principles, in the accumulated wisdom of universities and professional associations. The fact that an 18-year-old girl with no formal education was attempting something that violated everything he had learned offended him at a fundamental level. He stood at the entrance of the dugout one afternoon, his expensive Chicago overcoat contrasting sharply with the rough earthen walls. He had spent an hour taking measurements, consulting his instruments, shaking his head with increasing certainty. "Miss Magnuson, I must be direct with you. This structure violates every principle of sound engineering. The load-bearing capacity of these supports is insufficient. The moisture content of the soil will cause deterioration within months. You are, quite literally, building yourself a tomb." Ingrid nodded politely. "Thank you for your concern, Dr. Holt." She did not argue. He left confused and irritated, when unable to understand why his expertise did not seem to intimidate her. The second week of December brought Caleb Mercer. He appeared at the entrance of Ingrid's tunnel one evening, just after sunset, a thin boy of 16 with hungry eyes and bruises on his face that he tried to hide by keeping his head down. Copper growled at first, but then something in the boy's posture must have reminded the dog of his own days of being beaten and abandoned, because he stopped growling and simply watched. Caleb worked for Marcus Whitmore. He had been orphaned at 12 when his parents died of influenza, passed around between families who needed cheap labor, ended up at the Whitmore farm where the work was hard and the treatment was harder. He had watched Ingrid working for weeks. He had listened to the others mock her. But something about the way she worked, the certainty in her movements, the absolute refusal to acknowledge the laughter, had planted a seed of curiosity in his mind. Ingrid let him stand there for a long moment. "You are the boy from the Whitmore farm." Caleb pulled a canvas sack from behind his back. It contained bread and cheese, stolen from the Whitmore kitchen at considerable risk. "I brought food, in case you needed it." "I know they don't. I know nobody helps you." Ingrid took the food and studied the boy's face in the lamplight. His eyes were steady despite his nervousness. His hands, when she looked at them, bore the calluses of hard labor, not soft living. She pulled out one of her 2 chairs. "Sit, I will make tea." That night she showed him her grandfather's journal. She explained the concept of the frost line, the principle of thermal mass, the reason why the Earth stays warm in winter and cool in summer, while the air above it swings wildly between extremes. Caleb listened with an intensity that reminded Ingrid of herself at his age, hungry for knowledge, desperate for something that made sense in a world that often did not. "But why does the Earth stay the same temperature? How does it know?" Ingrid considered the question carefully. "The Earth does not know anything. It simply is. The air changes with every passing cloud, every shift of wind. It has no memory. But the Earth is different. It absorbs heat slowly, releases it slowly. It remembers the summer while the winter rages above. It remembers the winter while the summer burns. The Earth is patient in ways that humans have forgotten how to be." Caleb nodded slowly, and in his eyes Ingrid could see the beginning of understanding. After that, he came every night that he could slip away. Sometimes he brought food. Sometimes he brought tools borrowed from the Whitmore barn. Sometimes he brought nothing but his questions, and Ingrid answered them all with the patience her grandfather had shown her. She never asked about the bruises that appeared and faded on his face. She did not need to ask. She had seen Marcus Whitmore's temper, and she understood that asking would only add shame to injury. Instead, she taught. And in teaching, she found something she had not known she was missing. 54 degrees. That was the number Ingrid trusted more than any promise, more than any expert's opinion, more than any neighbor's advice. But would 54 degrees be enough when the temperature outside dropped to 40 below zero? That question kept her awake some nights, staring at the curved ceiling of her dugout, listening to Copper breathe beside her. She was about to find out. Christmas in Cedar Ridge was celebrated with a community gathering at Henderson's barn, where families brought food to share, and Father O'Brien led carols, and Marcus Whitmore, as the wealthiest landowner in the region, presided over the festivities like a benevolent king. Ingrid was not invited, or rather, she was not explicitly uninvited, but the absence of any message or mention made the exclusion clear enough. She stayed in her dugout, sharing a small meal with Copper, reading from her mother's Bible by lamplight, and trying not to think about the family celebrations she remembered from her childhood in Norway. Old Sven appeared at her door that evening with a bottle of aquavit and 2 tin cups. No one should drink alone on Christmas, not even a mole girl. They sat at her table and drank in comfortable silence. Two people who understood each other without needing to explain. At some point, Sven began to tell stories of the old country, of winters so fierce that cattle froze standing up in the fields, of houses buried so deep in snow that people had to dig tunnels to reach their barns. He told her about the winter of 1856 in Minnesota, when he was a young man newly arrived in America. A blizzard came down from Canada with no warning, catching settlers in their fields, in their wagons, and in their wooden houses that offered no more protection than paper against the killing cold. Over 200 people died in 3 days. Sven had survived because he was in a root cellar when the storm hit. The earth protected him while above, the world turned to ice. He looked around at the walls of Ingrid's dugout with something like reverence. You understand something that took me 60 years to learn. The earth does not care about our pride. It only cares about what works. She had no answer for that. She had no words for the feeling that swelled in her chest, the sense of connection to something larger than herself, to generations of people who had learned these lessons the hard way and passed them down through blood and memory. They finished the bottle as midnight approached. Sven left, walking steady despite the alcohol, and his footprints disappearing into the darkness. Ingrid stood at the entrance of her dugout and looked up at the stars, so clear and cold and impossibly distant. Somewhere out there, the wind was gathering. The signs came in the first week of January, small warnings that only those who knew how to read them could understand. The rabbits grew first so thick they looked twice their normal size, burrowing deep instead of foraging. The birds that usually stayed through winter vanished overnight, heading south 3 weeks earlier than normal. The horses in the valley grew restless, refusing to settle, their eyes rolling white when the wind shifted from the north. Copper began sleeping with his nose pressed against the entrance of the dugout, whimpering at sounds only he could hear. Ingrid watched and waited and said nothing. She had learned from her grandfather that animals remember what humans forget. They carry the knowledge of 1,000 generations in their blood, warnings passed down through instinct rather than language. When the animals are afraid, the wise human pays attention. The first 2 weeks of January 1888 were mild enough to make people forget that winter was not over. The temperature hovered around freezing during the day, sometimes climbing into the 40s when the sun was strong. Snow melted, mud appeared, children played outside without their heavy coats. The homesteaders of Cedar Ridge congratulated themselves on having survived another winter. They talked about spring planting, about the crops they would grow, about the expansion plans that better weather would allow. On January 11th, Ingrid walked into town and requested to speak at that evening's gathering. She stood before the same crowd that had laughed at her 3 months earlier. A storm is coming, not a normal storm. The rabbits know it. The birds know it. The horses know it. Everything that lives close to the earth knows what is coming, except for us. She paused, letting her words settle. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to prepare. Seal your houses. Stock your firewood inside. Do not let your children out of your sight. If I am wrong, you will have lost nothing but a day of work. If I am right, you will have saved your families. Marcus Whitmore shifted in his seat, his face reddening with familiar contempt. The mole girl is a weather prophet now. What's next, reading tea leaves? Father O'Brien crossed himself but said nothing. Billy Whitmore shouted from the back, his voice full of contempt. The mole girl thinks she can predict weather now. What's next, talking to God? Maybe she learned fortune-telling down in that coal mine, along with how to live like a rat. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Evelyn Ashford, in her finest winter dress, waved a dismissive hand. Dear child, I have lived through 30 Nebraska winters. If a storm were coming, I believe I would know before some girl who has been here all of 4 months. More laughter, louder this time. Ingrid looked at them all, these people who were so certain, so confident, so blind. You will see. She walked out of the barn and did not look back. The next morning, January 12th, 1888, dawned warm and bright. By 9 in the morning, the temperature had climbed to 40 degrees. Families sent their children to school in light jackets. Farmers left their cattle in far pastures. Marcus Whitmore organized an outdoor barbecue to celebrate the beautiful weather. Ingrid stayed in her dugout with the door sealed. At 11 in the morning, Copper began to whine. By noon, he was pressed against Ingrid's legs, trembling. At 1 in the afternoon, the sound arrived before the storm. A low rumble like thunder but continuous, like a train but coming from all directions at once. It vibrated through the ground, through the walls, through Ingrid's bones. She held Copper close and waited. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 minutes. What came next would be called the Schoolchildren's blizzard by historians. It would be called the Children's Blizzard by the newspapers. It would kill between 235 and 500 people across the Great Plains, many of them children who had been sent to school that morning without adequate clothing. In Cedar Ridge, they would simply call it the storm. The wind hit the valley like the fist of God. One moment, the sky was clear. The next, a wall of black and gray clouds swallowed the horizon, moving faster than any storm had a right to move, bringing with it a curtain of snow so dense that it was not snow at all but ice. Pulverized crystals driven by 70-mile-per-hour winds that stripped the warmth from anything they touched. The temperature, which had been 40 degrees at noon, plummeted to 20 below zero within the first hour. By nightfall, it would reach 47 degrees below zero. With wind chill, exposed skin would freeze in 30 seconds. Inside the wooden houses of Cedar Ridge, panic set in almost immediately. The wind found every gap in every wall. It screamed through the cracks around windows and doors. It drove snow into living rooms and kitchens, piling drifts against interior walls. The iron stoves that had seemed so powerful and reliable could not keep up with the heat being sucked out by the gale. At the Whitmore farm, Marcus stood in his living room and watched ice form on the inside of his windows. His wife, Rebecca, pulled every blanket in the house onto the bed, where their 3 young daughters huddled together, their breath fogging in the air. The stove consumed firewood at 3 times its normal rate. By evening, they would be burning furniture. At Henderson's barn, where the barbecue had been in full swing an hour earlier, the wind tore the roof off in a single gust. The cattle inside, 37 head representing a year's income, stampeded into the storm and were never seen alive again. At the schoolhouse, a 1-room wooden building about a mile from the center of town, 22 children and their teacher, Miss Sarah Patterson, found themselves trapped as the storm erased the outside world. Miss Patterson was 23 years old and had been teaching for only 4 months. She had no experience with weather like this. No one did. She kept the children calm at first, leading them in songs and games while the wind howled and the temperature inside the schoolhouse dropped. But within an hour, the single stove in the corner could no longer keep up. The children's breath became visible. Their fingers turned blue. She made a decision. She told the older children about a shed about 50 yards away, a more solid structure that might offer better shelter. She organized them, bundled them as best she could, and led them into the white chaos. 8 children made it to the shed. The rest had been sent home early by parents who sensed the danger, their instincts saving them where the teacher's knowledge failed. Miss Patterson did not make it. Inside the dugout, Ingrid felt the storm as a vibration more than a sound. The earth absorbed the fury of the wind, transmitted it as a low bass note that hummed through the walls without ever becoming threatening. The temperature inside stayed at 54 degrees, maybe dropping a degree or two from the cold seeping through the entrance. She had sealed the door with a heavy canvas flap weighted with stones. A small gap at the bottom allowed air circulation while keeping out the worst of the wind. The stove burned steadily, a small fire that raised the interior temperature to a comfortable 60 degrees. Copper lay beside her, still trembling, but his eyes had lost that wild terror from earlier. He understood in the way that animals understand, that they were safe. Old Sven had arrived that morning, before the storm hit. He was sitting in the second chair, smoking a pipe, watching the lamp flame flicker in the subtle air currents. "It begins," he said quietly. "God help those who would not listen." The knocking came around 4 in the afternoon. At first, Ingrid thought it was debris blown against the entrance by the wind. But then it came again, more insistent, with a rhythm that could only be human. She pulled back the canvas flap and found Caleb Mercer. His face was white with ice. His lips were blue. In his arms, he carried a bundle that Ingrid realized with dawning horror was a small child. "Emma, my sister, the school. I had to find her." Caleb collapsed the moment he was inside. The child was his sister, Emma, 6 years old. She had been at the schoolhouse when the storm hit. Caleb had been working in the Whitmore barn and had fought his way through the impossible weather to find her. The schoolhouse was destroyed when he arrived. The roof had caved in. He had found Emma wandering in circles near the shed, alone, crying, already showing signs of severe frostbite on her hands and face. The other children were still in the shed. Miss Patterson was somewhere in the storm. Ingrid wrapped Emma in blankets while Sven worked on Caleb, forcing hot tea between his frozen lips, rubbing circulation back into his hands and feet. The question hung in the air, unasked but impossible to ignore. Caleb grabbed Ingrid's wrist with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone who had just been pulled back from death. "The other children, they're still out there, in the shed. They'll die." Ingrid nodded. She found a 100-foot length of rope that she had bought for hauling timber. She tied one end around her waist, handed the other end to Sven. "If the rope goes slack for more than 5 minutes, do not come for me. Keep them alive." The old man nodded, understanding. Ingrid pushed through the canvas flap and stepped into the end of the world. 100 feet of rope, negative 47 degrees, zero visibility. That was what stood between Ingrid and the children who were dying in the shed. She had seconds to make each decision. If she went the wrong direction, if she lost the rope, if she hesitated for even a moment, she would be dead. And so would they. The cold hit her like a physical assault. Every exposed inch of skin screamed in protest. The wind drove ice crystals into her face like 1,000 tiny knives. She could not open her eyes more than a slit. She could not breathe without the air burning her lungs. She had memorized the direction to the schoolhouse. Due west about a quarter mile, past the Henderson property and up a small rise. In normal conditions, a 10-minute walk. In this storm, it might as well have been 100 miles. She crawled. The ground was the only thing she could be certain of. As long as she kept her hands on the frozen earth, she could maintain some sense of orientation. The rope played out behind her, her lifeline back to the dugout. The only thing that stood between her and becoming another frozen corpse on the prairie. The sound was beyond description. It was not wind anymore. It was something alive, something hungry, something that wanted her dead. It screamed in frequencies that bypassed her ears and went straight to the terror centers of her brain. She kept crawling. Time lost all meaning. Minutes felt like hours. She counted the distance in body lengths, knowing that each push forward was 3 feet, knowing that she would have to make this journey multiple times if she was going to save anyone. Her hands stopped hurting around the 100-foot mark. That was bad. That meant the cold was winning. She kept crawling. The rope went taut behind her. She had reached the limit. She tied the end to a fence post that her searching hands found half buried in a drift. Now she had a guide rope, a path back, but only if she could extend it. She pulled off her outer coat, cut it into strips with the knife she carried on her belt, knotted the strips to the rope. Crude, dangerous, but it gave her another 30 feet. She kept crawling. And then, impossibly, her hand touched wood. The shed. She had found it. She pulled herself along the wall, searching for the entrance, and squeezed through a gap in the boards. Inside, she found 8 children huddled in a pile of hay, barely conscious. 8 out of the 22 who had been in school that morning. The others had been sent home early by parents who sensed the danger. These 8 had no parents nearby. These 8 had been left behind. Near the door, half buried in snow that had blown through the cracks, she found Miss Patterson. The young teacher was frozen solid, her body curled around 2 of the smallest children as if she could protect them with her own flesh. Her face was peaceful, almost serene, but the 2 children in her arms were as still as she was. She had carried them this far. She had found this shed. She had saved 8 lives before the cold claimed hers. Ingrid closed her eyes for one breath. Then she turned to the living. She started with the 2 who were most alert, a boy of about 12 and a girl who might have been 10. She tied them together with strips torn from her remaining clothes, then tied them to her own waist. She grabbed 2 more children, the smallest ones, and carried one under each arm. Follow the rope. Do not let go. No matter what you hear, no matter how scared you are, do not let go of the rope. She began the crawl back. The children who could move crawled behind her, following the rope, following her voice as she shouted instructions that were almost swallowed by the wind. The return journey was nightmare. The added weight of children, the drag of others behind her, the knowledge that she had left 4 more in that shed, that every second she spent getting back to the dugout was a second they might be dying. She found the fence post. She followed her extended rope. She reached the entrance of the dugout and all but threw the 4 children through the canvas flap. She did not stop. She did not rest. She turned and crawled back into the storm. The second trip brought the remaining 4 children. All 8 delivered to the dugout in 2 trips that took maybe 40 minutes total. 40 minutes that felt like 40 years. She collapsed through the canvas flap, and Sven caught her before she hit the ground. The dugout was warm. The children were crying. Emma was awake now, asking for her brother, and Caleb was holding her, tears freezing on his cheeks. Ingrid tried to stand, tried to say that she needed to go back out, tried to explain that there were more people out there, more people dying, more people who needed her. Sven held her down with surprising strength. Rest. Others will come. You cannot save them all if you are dead. And then the next knock came at the entrance. They came throughout the night. Billy Whitmore arrived around 7 in the evening, dragging his father on an improvised sled. Marcus had been injured when part of his barn collapsed. His leg was broken, maybe in 2 places. He was barely conscious, his face gray with pain and cold. Billy's eyes were wild when he came through the entrance. He stood there looking around at the earthen walls, at the warm stove, at the children huddled under blankets, at the steam rising from cups of hot tea. Marcus's eyes found Ingrid through the haze of pain. His frozen hand gripped her wrist with surprising strength. His lips moved, and she had to lean close to hear him over the sound of the wind still howling outside. Save my boy, please. Leave me if you have to. Just save my boy. Ingrid looked at the man who had mocked her for months, who had bet against her survival, who had called her crazy and dangerous, and on the same man who was now begging for his son's life. She pointed to an empty space by the stove. Both of you, by the fire, now. Dr. Franklin Holt arrived around 9, hypothermic and rambling, his fingers blackened with frostbite that would eventually cost him 3 digits on his left hand. He had been caught at the Henderson property when the storm hit and had wandered for hours before someone pointed him toward the light that was barely visible from Ingrid's chimney shaft. He stood in the dugout, staring at his notebook, staring at the walls, staring at the thermometer that Ingrid had mounted near the entrance. 58 degrees, with 18 people, with -47 outside. This should not be possible. He began to laugh, then he began to cry. Then he collapsed into the corner and did not move for hours. Evelyn Ashford came near midnight, carried by 2 of her farm hands who were themselves barely able to walk. Her fur coat, which had cost more than most families earned in a year, was frozen solid. Her face, usually so composed and proud, was white with terror. She looked at Ingrid across the crowded dugout. No words came. None were needed. Ingrid pointed to a spot near the wall where there was still room. Father O'Brien arrived near dawn, having spent the entire night trying to reach families who lived on the outskirts of the community. He had given his coat to a child he found wandering alone. He had given his gloves to an old woman whose hands were turning black. He had given everything he had, and still it was not enough. He knelt by the stove, his lips moving in silent prayer, his eyes closed against the reality of how many people had died while he walked through the darkness trying to save them. Martha Simmons came with her 3 children, all of them crying, none of them hurt. She had been wise enough to realize that her wooden house was not going to survive the night, humble enough to swallow her pride and seek help from the girl she had gossiped about for months. By morning, there were 23 people in Ingrid's dugout, 23 people who had spent the night in a space designed for one, 23 people who were alive because an 18-year-old girl had dug a hole in a hillside while everyone laughed. The storm raged for 3 more days. Inside the dugout, time became strange. There was no day or night, and only the lamplight and the stove and the constant presence of too many people in too small a space. Ingrid organized a rationing system for her food supplies. She assigned sleeping shifts so that everyone could rest without the space becoming completely chaotic. Copper moved among the survivors like a therapy dog, letting children pet him, pressing against adults who seemed most distressed, doing the work of comfort that words could not accomplish. On the second night, little Emma Mercer finally stopped shivering. She had been silent since Caleb brought her in, her eyes distant, her body rigid with a cold that went deeper than temperature. Copper, as if sensing what she needed, patted over and lay down beside her. He rested his head on her small lap and looked up at her with patient brown eyes. Emma's hand moved slowly, tentatively, as to touch his fur. "Can I pet the doggy? He looks warm." Her voice was barely a whisper, the first words she had spoken in nearly 12 hours. Ingrid felt something break open in her chest. She knelt beside the little girl. "His name is Copper, and he would love nothing more than to keep you warm." Emma's fingers sank into Copper's fur. The dog's tail thumped gently against the packed earth floor. And for the first time since the storm began, Emma smiled. Dr. Holt, once he recovered from his hypothermia, began taking scientific measurements. He documented the temperature at different points in the dugout. He noted the humidity, the air quality, the rate of fuel consumption. He filled pages of his notebook with numbers and calculations. We're trying to understand how this impossible structure was doing what his engineering education said it could not do. On the second night, he approached Ingrid. "I need to understand. Everything I know, everything I was taught, says this should not work, but it does. How?" Ingrid handed him her grandfather's journal without a word. Holt spent hours reading it, translating the Norwegian with Sven's help, making his own notes, asking Ingrid questions about techniques and principles that her grandfather had understood instinctively. Marcus Whitmore's fever broke on the second night. He had been in and out of consciousness since Billy brought him in, his broken leg splinted with wood from Ingrid's firewood pile, his body fighting both the injury and the hypothermia. He woke around midnight, his eyes clear for the first time in days. Then he looked around the crowded dugout. He looked at his son, asleep against the wall. He looked at his wife, Rebecca, and their 3 daughters, who had been rescued the previous day. Then his eyes found Ingrid, sitting by the stove, keeping watch while others slept. He tried to sit up, winced at the pain in his leg, and settled for raising himself on one elbow. "Miss Magnuson, I need to tell you something." The dugout fell silent. Even those who had been sleeping seemed to sense that something important was happening. "I wrote a letter to the land office in October. I told them you were unfit to hold a claim. I told them a woman alone, living in a hole in the ground, was a disgrace to the Homestead Act. I wanted this land for Billy. I wanted you gone." His voice cracked. His eyes glistened with something that might have been tears. When I was lying out there in the snow dying, you came for me. You dragged me into the place I tried to take from you. You gave me shelter in the home I called a grave. The silence stretched. 22 people held their breath. Ingrid looked at the man who had been her enemy. She looked at his broken leg, his frightened family, his shame-filled eyes. The land does not belong to any of us, Mr. Whitmore. We belong to the land. And tonight, the land is protecting all of us, even those who do not deserve it. Marcus bowed his head. Tears fell onto the packed earth floor. I was wrong. We were all wrong. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you did for us. The words hung in the air, simple and profound. And in the warmth of that earthen room, something shifted. Not forgiveness exactly. Something deeper. Understanding. 23 people, 3 days, one small dugout that everyone said would fail. Sometimes the things that save us are the things we were too proud to consider. And sometimes the people who save us are the ones we tried hardest to push away. The storm ended on the morning of January 16th. Ingrid was the first to emerge, pushing through the canvas flap into a world transformed. The landscape was unrecognizable. Where there had been farms and fences and the familiar shapes of the valley, there was now only white, endless drifts sculpted by the wind into shapes that looked almost architectural. The silence was the most shocking thing. After 3 days of constant screaming wind, the sudden quiet was almost painful. She stood at the entrance of her dugout and looked down toward where the town should be. Smoke rose from a few scattered points, thin gray threads against the bright blue sky. Signs of life, signs that not everyone had died. But the gaps were terrifying. The Henderson barn, which had been the heart of the community, was simply gone. The schoolhouse was a pile of scattered boards, half buried in drifts. Several of the wooden houses had collapsed entirely, their walls no match for the wind and the weight of the ice. One by one, the survivors emerged from the dugout behind her. They stood in silence. 23 people who had spent 3 days together in a space that should not have been able to keep them alive, looking out at the devastation that had claimed everyone who had not found shelter. Dr. Holt was the first to speak. He held up his notebook, the one he had filled with measurements and calculations over the past 3 days. I have spent my entire career believing that modern engineering knows better than ancient wisdom. I have 3 university degrees that taught me to dismiss anything that did not come from a textbook, and every single thing I believed was wrong. He looked at Ingrid with something like reverence. This structure should not work. According to everything I was taught, it should not work. But it does. And 23 people are alive because an 18-year-old girl trusted her grandfather more than she trusted experts like me. Nobody laughed this time. The final count took days to determine. 12 people died in Cedar Ridge during the blizzard of 1888. 12 people out of a community of about 150. By the standards of the disaster, in which killed hundreds across the Great Plains, Cedar Ridge had been fortunate. But fortune was the wrong word. Miss Sarah Patterson was found near the shed, frozen in the act of trying to return to the schoolhouse for more children. She had saved 8 lives before the cold claimed hers. She was 23 years old. 3 of the Henderson children died in their collapsed barn. A family of 5 named Morrison, who lived at the far edge of the community and could not be reached in time, died together in their wooden house when the roof caved in under the weight of ice. Others lost fingers, toes, pieces of themselves to frostbite. Dr. Holt lost 3 fingers on his left hand. An old man named Peterson lost both feet. The cost of survival was written on their bodies forever. But 23 people who had found their way to Ingrid's dugout walked out alive and whole. That fact rippled through Cedar Ridge, through the surrounding counties, through the territory and beyond. The mole girl had been right. The spring of 1888 brought changes to Cedar Ridge that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. 14 families dug storm cellars before the next winter. They came to Ingrid for advice, for guidance, for the knowledge that she had carried from Norway to Pennsylvania to this hillside. She taught them freely, asking nothing in return, showing them how to find the right location, how to angle the entrance, how to create ventilation, how to reinforce the walls. Old Sven became her assistant, translating her ideas into the practical language of farming people on adding his own experience from decades of prairie living. Caleb Mercer became her first official apprentice. He moved out of the Whitmore farm and built himself a dugout on the corner of Ingrid's property. He learned everything she could teach him, and he began teaching others. Marcus Whitmore withdrew his complaint to the land office, the one he had filed months earlier trying to have Ingrid's claim revoked. He did more than that. He wrote a letter to the territorial newspaper describing what had happened, describing how he had mocked Ingrid's construction and how it had saved his life. The letter was reprinted in papers across the country. He limped for the rest of his life from the injury he sustained during the storm, but he never complained about it. He called it his reminder. Martha Simmons, Jan, who had gossiped about Ingrid for months, became one of her strongest advocates. She told anyone who would listen about the night in the dugout, about how Ingrid had shared her food without complaint, about how she had never once said the words that everyone expected her to say. Martha's tongue, which had once spread mockery, now spread a different kind of story. Evelyn Ashford, the wealthy widow, came to Ingrid one morning in April with a legal document. She was deeding 40 acres of her land to Ingrid, the 40 acres that bordered Ingrid's property to the north. The proud widow who had offered to buy Ingrid's land at any price had become a quieter woman, humbled by how close she had come to death in her expensive furs. The 40 acres were only part of her debt. She also funded the construction of 3 community storm shelters, each built to Ingrid's specifications, each dug deep into the protective earth. Father O'Brien stopped talking about pagan practices. He began speaking instead about wisdom, about the ways that providence works through unexpected people, about the importance of humility in the face of knowledge that we do not yet understand. Dr. Holt published a paper in an engineering journal about the thermal properties of earth-sheltered construction. He cited Ingrid's grandfather's journal extensively. He admitted in print that his initial assessment had been completely wrong. The story of the mole girl spread far beyond Cedar Ridge. Newspapers from Chicago to San Francisco picked it up. A magazine from New York sent a reporter to interview Ingrid, though she said little and showed him even less. The attention made her uncomfortable, but she understood that the story needed to be told. In the summer of 1889, Ingrid married Thomas Brennan, an Irish homesteader who had arrived in Cedar Ridge after the blizzard. He had been lost in a smaller storm that March, wandering in circles until he saw the smoke from Ingrid's chimney and followed it to safety. He said later that he knew he would marry her the moment he stepped through the entrance and felt the warmth that had no right to exist. They had 4 children together, 3 boys and a girl. All of them grew up knowing how to read the earth, how to understand the warnings that nature gives if you know how to listen, how to build shelter that works with the land instead of against it. Copper lived until 1899, growing old and gray and slow, but never leaving Ingrid's side until his last breath. She buried him beside the entrance of the dugout, marking the spot with a stone carved with simple words: "The friend who never doubted." The dugout itself remained standing for nearly 80 years. In 1967, when the land was being surveyed for a new highway, a team from the Nebraska Historical Society discovered the structure. It was overgrown, partially collapsed at the rear, but still intact enough to be remarkable. They found Ingrid's grandfather's journal still on the shelf beside where her bed had been. They found the carved words above the entrance, Norwegian script that translated to a simple truth: Jorden husker det vi glemmer. The earth remembers what we forget. In 1900 Audiogalfjords, researchers from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln conducted a study of the dugout's thermal properties. They installed modern sensors, took readings over an entire year, analyzed the data with computers and engineering models. Their conclusion confirmed what Ingrid had known nearly a century earlier. The structure functioned exactly as she had claimed. The thermal mass of the Earth, combined with proper ventilation and modest supplemental heating, maintained a stable interior temperature regardless of outside conditions. The principles were the same ones being used in passive house design, in earth-sheltered architecture, in the most advanced energy-efficient buildings of the late 20th century. Ingrid Magnusson, Brennan had figured it all out in 1887, using nothing but her grandfather's wisdom and her own determination. She died in 1953 at the age of 84, in the same dugout where she had saved 23 lives 65 years earlier. Her children said she went peacefully in her sleep, with the great-great-grandpuppy of Copper lying beside her bed. She was buried next to Thomas on the hillside above the dugout, in a spot that overlooked the valley where Cedar Ridge had grown into a proper town with paved roads and electric lights and buildings that no longer feared the winter. Her grave marker was simple, just her name and dates, but someone had added a line at the bottom that captured everything that needed to be said. They laughed when she dug into the earth. The earth had the last laugh, and that is the story of the mole girl of Cedar Ridge, a girl who lost her mother to a cold house and vowed to never let the cold take anyone else she could save. A girl who listened to her grandfather's wisdom when everyone else called it foolishness. A girl who dug into the earth while others reached for the sky and discovered that sometimes the old ways survive because they work. If you enjoyed the story, please like and subscribe for more tales of survival and human resilience. And I would love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever been mocked for believing in something that you knew in your heart was true? Have you ever been the person everyone laughed at, only to be proven right in the end? Sometimes the people the world calls crazy are simply the ones who remember what the rest of us have forgotten. Until next time, stay warm, stay safe, and never stop listening to the earth. The end.